Good morning. I'm Jeff Hill, a member of Westminster's Board of Trustees and also the Environmental Justice team. I am pleased to join with the Social Ministry team today to present this morning's forum. The Social Justice Forum's theme this program year is investing in each other's future. Through these forums, we aim to learn about opportunities for engagement and action by Westminster members to help ensure all our neighbors thrive. Our forum today is on investing at Westminster and the principles of responsible investing. At Westminster, we have a strong endowment. It's a pool of money that's been built up over the years, and it's I like to think of it as one of the three legs to the stool of what keeps our operation running, along with our pledging and our big projects like ongoing Enduring Hope. The Westminster Endowment funds 100% of our property budget, which is the big improvement projects and the maintenance projects. We've got organ maintenance and a big air conditioner that we need now. The technology of live stream and those kinds of things are funded by the endowment. Also, $1 out of $5 of our regular operating comes from the endowment. So it's very important. But we hope to invest it in a way that's socially responsible. Westminster forums often bring in experts from outside. This is kind of our own gang. Today it's leaders talking about our own operations at Westminster. We're pleased to welcome Elder Rocky Rockenstein. He'll tell us how our investing is developed at Westminster. Jason Spaeth, chair of our investment committee on the Board of Trustees. He'll share our investment policy. And we're joined by David Stevens from Wells Fargo, our portfolio manager, and his cohort, if that's appropriate, Bill Blackburn, also from Wells Fargo. A couple of items. For those of us attending in person in the Meisel room, raise your hand. We can be pretty informal because we have a small group. But by that I mean you could actually interrupt with a question, I think, or we'll have Q&A after each speaker so we don't have to wait till the end. For those attending on the live stream, submit your question or comment in the live stream chat and we'll monitor and answer those questions. We don't often give full introductions to our own Westminster members when we have meetings, but I'd like to recognize Rocky. There are always new members and maybe some people don't know a lot about Rocky. Walter Rockenstein is a long-term member with significant involvement at Westminster. He's on session, actually in his fourth run now as a ruling elder. He came to Minneapolis a few weeks ago now, I think, from Yale Law School, joined Faegre and Benson, the largest law firm in Minneapolis, and was elected to the Minneapolis City Council in 1974 as, hold it, the first Republican, when parties were a little different than they are now. There became more Republicans on the Minneapolis City Council, and Rocky was elected the minority leader for that group. Listing Rocky's activities and Jody's activities at Westminster would be a fool's errand, but Rocky's been our primary legal counsel for decades. It's worthy of note that Rocky served as moderator of our presbytery, a fairly big job, as the leader of the 50 congregations in Minnesota and part of Wisconsin. We recently sent him as commissioner to the General Assembly of PCUSA. Now, in the environmental area, and of more recent note, Rocky negotiated our contract with Renee Sola. So the power in this building is significantly generated by solar through that contract, and what isn't solar is now wind. Rocky's assignment today is to take us back to the beginning of our investing and through his involvement.
Thank you, Jeff. I want to indicate that when I was elected as a Republican, I was generally known as a Lincoln Roosevelt Republican. I don't think those exist anymore. The party went that way, and I just kind of kept going on the middle of the road, or more, maybe a little right of the middle of the road. I would not, if I were running for public office, and I don't, I'm a recovering politician, but if I were running for public office, I would not be running as a Republican today. My job here this morning is pretty straightforward. It's to give a little history, if you will, about Westminster's historic investments and particularly about the social and environmental policies related to those investments. Now, before 1971, I can't find a record of a formally adopted policy that involved social or environmental issues. But there were three types of investment that were clearly verboten, not allowed. Does anybody want to take a guess at what the Board of Trustees just did not invest in, period? Alcohol. Tobacco, good one. What would be the third one, do you think? Gambling. Ooh, the big three: alcohol, tobacco, and gambling. No investment. And that continued until the adoption of the policy that Jason is going to talk about in 2021. The more, as you will see, a very different approach. That's what I would call a negative approach. You pick those you aren't going to invest in, period. In 1971, though, the National Church had created a committee called the Mission Responsibility Through Investment Committee. And it was to consider, let me quote here, the social and racial teachings of the General Assembly and the Confession of 1967 as they focus on peace, racial justice, economic and social justice, and protection of the environment. But again, this is what I would call a negative approach. They decided which companies did not meet that, and they said you won't invest in these companies. Now, this was advisory to congregations. Congregations didn't have to follow it. It was even advisory to the two major boards of the church, the Board of Pensions and the Presbyterian Investment Funds. Although the Presbyterian Investment Corporation did follow that. And they began then to list companies, and eventually that list got up to over 50. Some of you would have expected, like Japan Tobacco or American Tobacco. Tobacco was on their list, but Caterpillar Corporation was on because of its manufacture of Caterpillar equipment to be used in Israel, and particularly in the demolition of settlements that involved Palestinian people. A lot of weapons manufacturing firms were on the list because there was a general position of the church that we should not be supporting weapons industries until we had a reduction in the overall budget, military budget. So that policy actually lasts till today. That is still basically the way that the National Church works on its investment responsibility, is it focuses on a negative policy, although it appears with a change that may be as recent as last week, that discussion is now looking at maybe a more positive approach to investing, much like the one that Westminster adopted. In 1986 and 87, there was a major endowment review, and it resulted in two major changes that affected the social and environmental investments. The first one was, always before there'd just been a big endowment. That was referred to as the Westminster Endowment. That endowment group decided that we ought to name separate funds within that, because as you know, some of those endowment funds are restricted. They can only be used for one purpose. For instance, a lot of money had been given strictly for the building, maintaining the building. So the Building for Today and Tomorrow Fund within the endowment was put together, and all of those funds that were restricted to the building were put together. Program support funds, that was the general endowment money that had been given just to support the church. No restrictions or very few restrictions was put in that. A mission fund was created. Here's the first social or environmental piece of this. And there were and had been traditionally, there had been funds that were given strictly, and their proceeds were supposed to go strictly to mission work of the church. There was a music fund. Frankly, there's a very tiny flower fund. We have some very narrow gifts in the past. So that was the first, the mission fund, and that was an advantage because now people realize that if they wanted to give to the endowment and have the proceeds of their, the annual result of that investment go to mission, they could restrict, and there was a fund to put that in, and that actually resulted at that time in more contributions to the mission endowment. But the second change was one that actually, those affected the earnings of the fund. But what about the overall investment of the fund? And this is the first change that I've been able to find where something besides the negative policy was adopted. There was a charge to the Board of Trustees to proactively invest 5% of the endowment's market value in positive investment, provided it had a reasonably similar financial return to the rest of the endowment. So you weren't going to pay a big penalty, and there were some objectives that were mentioned in that. As far as we can tell historically, that was followed for a few years, and then it was discontinued. We're not sure why, but it just fell by the wayside. So but there was no change to the negative policy of following the mission responsibility through investment list of prohibited. It was actually called the MRTI prohibited list. That was the name of it. So that brings us then to 2020, when the Board of Trustees and the session convened a committee whose job was to look at that whole question of social, environmental, racial justice, and how we might invest the main body of the fund in a way that would promote that. So that's a very brief history of how we got to what Jason's going to talk about, which is the policy and how it, and a little bit, I'm sure he's going to cover something about the endowment itself, because I don't think most people realize quite how large our endowment is or how significant it is in the life of the church. But if you have questions about the history, now's the time to fire them off. Get the microphone so people, yeah.
I mean, you mentioned that they wouldn't be investing in certain whatever investments that were negative or whatever.
Right.
Not sure how you phrased it, but now, of course, did they follow that up with those investments? Like, you're investing in this thing is probably invested in 100 other things. Did they follow it downstream, so to speak?
I think they tried, but you should probably ask the people from Wells Fargo that question. Because
We are going to drill down on that as we
Okay.
move forward.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Especially as conglomerates grew in the marketplace, how can you follow that downstream? And they are going to address that, so I don't know, so I'll stop at that point. Other questions about the history? Okay.
All right.
Jeff?
Thanks, Rocky. Jason Spaeth will be next. He's in his 9th year as a trustee, and he is an investment guy. He's the chair of our investment committee, which he's been for 6 of the 9 years. He's also at Westminster a member of the ongoing volunteers, which are the guys who will do anything, anytime on short notice, which I found kind of interesting. Jason has a BA in economics and English from Lawrence and got his master's in finance and economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. He had a successful career, 17 years with Varde Investments, and took that organization to investing from the U.S. into Europe. And he kind of stepped back and had a rethinking, and he and his wife, Ann, wanted to spend a little more time on things like social justice in themselves. And in that sense, last May he presented a webinar, which I found interesting. He's worked with the Halftime Institute, which is an organization that is faith-based that helps with those transitions. But his webinar last May was on spontaneous compassion. And it was particularly about his work in saving grasslands and supporting Afghan refugees. But back to business, he's still got his finger in investment. He's founding partner of Highland Hill Investment Partners, and Darrigan's Creek Capital. In his job, he's the key man in communicating what our policy at Westminster is and our objectives to Wells Fargo.
I have a few notes on my phone here that I'll reference, so I'm not sending any text messages. Well, I'm really grateful to be here, and I appreciate those who have shown up. This isn't, the most engaging topic at times, but I love it. I've spent my career in this area and enjoy talking about investing and in particular some of the changes afoot for institutions involved in managing substantial assets on behalf of their various stakeholders. So an endowment, I'm just going to kind of set the table, but by definition, it's a gift or a bequest to an individual or an institution. Typically, those assets are held in perpetuity, and the income that is earned off those assets go to fund a particular cause. So, like Rocky said, over the years, people have been very generous at Westminster and have given money to an endowment, and some of those monies are dedicated to flowers. A substantial amount is given without various restrictions, but is used to fund the operations and the day-to-day activities of the church, like this forum, like worship services, like the beautiful music we have here. And as a member, I'm super grateful for those folks who have funded the endowment over the years and have given Westminster such a gift that we now fund $1 out of every 5 that our operating budget includes. And that's things like ministry, faith in action, pretty much everything you interact with here at Westminster, $1 out of $5 from the endowment funds that. So these assets, like most endowments, are invested in perpetuity. Our investment policy statement uses that particular word. This is the document that Rocky mentioned that governs the endowment. It's like the 10 commandments for the endowment. Thou shalt not do this, you can do this. And that document's been adopted by the Board of Trustees and the session of Westminster. And it's utilized by the committee to make sure that our investment advisors are adhering to it. That's one of the jobs of the Endowment and Investment Committee. The other job that we have is to update it from time to time. And Rocky mentioned, the changes that have occurred over the years. But currently, the endowment utilizes an environmental, social, governance framework to choose investments that Wells Fargo chooses on our behalf in order to fulfill our goal of being socially responsible investors. So in the past, our socially responsible investing framework was mainly that list that Rocky mentioned. So Wells Fargo would say, hey, do we have any Hewlett Packard? Do we have any Caterpillar? We need to sell those securities because they're now on this list. And that's how we fulfilled our socially responsible mandate. Now we fulfill our socially responsible mandate through the framework of environmental, social, and governance criteria that Wells Fargo has established, utilizing the best thinking that's out there in the universe, and incorporates that into the management of the endowment's assets. The reason why endowments can sometimes wrestle with these topics is that on one hand, we have this job of investing assets in perpetuity for the benefit of an organization, Westminster in this case. So roughly 4 to 6% over the years of the assets of the endowment are spent on operating budget, property, things of that nature. So if we want to hold on to these things in perpetuity, we generally speaking need to earn more than we spend so that we can maintain the purchasing power of the endowment. So that's particularly difficult in an environment we live in today with inflation of 8%. You know, we need to earn, if you will, if we spend 4 and inflation's 8, that means we need to earn greater than 12 just to tread water. That's pretty tough. But when you restrict your investing universe, sometimes that can clash with the goal of perpetuity. Sometimes. And it's difficult when you have a do not invest list. Those are challenging things for an investment manager to say, okay, take all these corporations off the list. Here's what's left. Go and earn us more than we're spending. ESG, on the other hand, provides just a framework. It's very positive. It doesn't say you can't invest in XYZ. It says we're going to look at the world through this lens and pick the very best companies that fulfill these goals. And it's much more flexible for our investment managers to implement. And it has shown over the years to actually perform at or above a universe that's not restricted, which is very positive. It was some of the data we looked at when we were adopting the policy. So, like Rocky said, about a couple years ago, a subcommittee was formed because the EIC kept wrestling with a fiduciary role, investing in perpetuity, ESG, how's this all going to work? We needed a more focused study on that. And a subcommittee was formed between Faith in Action, Social Justice, and some members of the Investment and Endowment Committee. They got together, they created a wonderful template and a policy, and Wells supplied us with data as to, hey, how would have the endowment looked over the last 5 to 10 years if we had adopted this? What our returns would be, what our balances might be relative to what our spend rate was, all those things. And with that data and the recommendation from the committee, the investment and endowment committee decided to change the IPS, and we recommended that change to the board of trustees, and it was ultimately adopted in January 21. These are, this is a Presbyterian church, so we follow good order. Sometimes these things take a little while, but it got through. And we've been investing with this framework ever since January of 21, so over the last couple of years. A little bit, again, setting the table, the committee's made up of volunteers. So it's not our job to pick investments. We we don't do that. That probably wouldn't be a good thing for us to do on a part-time basis. But what we do is, one, we try to find an investment advisor that's very competent and skilled and will manage our assets appropriately. Westminster has chosen Wells Fargo, and we've had a relationship with them for as long as I've been on the committee, and it dates back even longer. So I don't know, 20 years, 20 plus years. It's been quite a while and a very fruitful relationship. But we rely on our investment advisor to advise us on things like asset allocation. So, how much exposure should we have to equities versus bonds versus real assets like commodities or real estate? What managers should the endowment choose to implement those allocations? So under equities, we might have 3 or 4 different investment managers managing that. Wells, as an investment advisor, looks at all these managers and says, hey, do you guys follow ESG or not? That's one of their main jobs. And the other important role that Wells plays is maintaining adherence to that IPS and reporting back to the committee, the various boards, as to results and where our allocations stand. We have been fortunate today to have a couple members from the Wells team here, and Jeff will introduce them, but thank you for being here, Bill and David, before I leave the mic. And they'll get into more detail about what ESG means, and how they implement our policy. So with that, I'll conclude. I don't know if there's any questions for me at this point in time.
Any questions for Jason? There's some feeling on the Environmental Justice Task Force that we should be divested of all fossil fuels. And I noticed that the Presbyterian Church USA has fought with that, and they refuse to do it, which has angered some people that are in the environmental camp. Are we that specific in our directions on anything to Wells?
No, we're not. I think Wells will interpret what ESG is, and we got comfortable with their interpretation. So, sometimes when people talk about ESG, they focus on the E, but it's ESG. So you might have an incredibly environmentally responsible firm. There was some not so good press about a solar panel manufacturer that went belly up a few years back. But their hiring practices, they have differences in pay between men and women. They discriminate racially vis-a-vis their data. These are some of the things that are also part of ESG, not just fossil fuels. And so we rely on Wells Fargo to make those determinations. The other part, G, is how well does the company treat its stakeholders? Is it fair to its shareholders? Is it transparent? Does it have appropriate checks and balances in their corporate policies to allow for a well-run, fiduciary responsible organization? So there's a lot to ESG, not just fossil fuels, and all those things need to be considered.
If a Westminster member had specific questions for you on investments, can you dig into it a little bit? For example, I know there's a lot of funds and it gets complex, but what if somebody wanted to know, do we have some Exxon? Could they email you? And should we publicize that to everyone and encourage a lot of questions?
Well, to be frank, there's piles of research to suggest that 80% of a portfolio's return is determined by how you allocate those assets. 20% is determined by how good your investment manager is and how good they select securities. So as a volunteer, this is like Jason talking, okay? This is not official policy. But if 80% of our return is determined by how we allocate assets, I'm far more interested in spending my time hearing from David what he thinks the right allocation ought to be than does he invest in Chevron, Exxon, Coca-Cola, or any other securities. The only reason why I would care is if Exxon was on a, outside of the ESG framework, and I'd want David to explain, well, why do we have it then? But no, I'm not a good source for that information. However, I'd pass the email on to David, and he could answer that question in probably 30 seconds. So.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Appreciate it. And appreciate your 9 years.
Thank you.
David Stevens is here. He's our guy at Wells Fargo, at least in terms of investments. And I talked about how this seminar is an insider, and I consider him in our group because he's been working tightly with us for 6 years on this. He has an economics degree from Western Michigan University, and he's been doing this kind of work since 1985. He was at American Express prior to his term at Wells Fargo. I should treat him fairly here and talk a little bit on the personal side. He spent 7 years supporting an organization near his hometown in Elk River, Land of Lakes Choir Boys, which grew to 6 choirs and is serving 120 kids now. And, I mentioned on Jason, and it's true of me, and I think Rocky's post-retirement, so there's transitions going on these elderly speakers we have today. He may be the younger, he's approaching it in his preparations, he's getting back to his roots as a high school thespian. He's now working with the board of directors of Theater in the Round, Seven Corners, to help bring them to more modern business practices and help them come out of COVID, actually. Anyway, he's been with Wells for 21 years, and he's our senior portfolio manager. David.
Thank you, Jeff. Really glad to be here. And Wells Fargo is really proud to have a long relationship with Westminster. When I started working with Westminster, Julie, who was the business manager at the time, said, I think through predecessor organizations of Wells Fargo, if you will, the relationship goes back about 100 years from banking relationships early on, and we're very proud. So I'm not exactly sure how long we've been helping manage the endowment, but I know it's 20 plus years, and I joined this team 6 years ago and been working with Jason and the committee. So social impact investing, ESG, it's value aligning investment in your portfolio. The church is very involved in social. They have a mission, and it's aligning the investments along with the mission. And it's, one of the things we were talking about before is often there's a term out there called greenwashing, where you pretend to be socially responsible by spouting things, but underlying you're not really doing that. So to a certain extent, if you weren't embracing ESG in your endowment, you would be to a bit of greenwashing your portfolio by saying, hey, we're doing all this wonderful things as a church, but over here on this other side, we're not embracing it. So I think it's really important that they have embraced ESG. It did take a while. The road is not a straight one. To Rocky's point before, it's never quick and easy. It takes time, but we've gotten there. They've gotten there. We were just along and helping provide guidance and discussion points and some data periodically. Now the page down button doesn't want to work. So tools of active ownership. So as an ESG or an SRA manager, there's the old school way of doing this was what we talked about, that exclusion list or divest assets, right? Back in the 60s and 70s, even into the 80s, divesting, right? Don't be invested in any company that's doing business in South Africa. Don't own tobacco stocks. Don't own this. Don't. Divestment is still a tool, but we prefer to walk through some of these other steps first. Dialogue, talking with the company. Hey, we think you're lacking in this area. We think you should, maybe your board is all guys that look like me, right? It's not a diverse board, ethnically, gender. Your board should be diverse. Your senior leadership should be more diverse. You could be doing better in environmental things, doing more recycling, whatever. We can have an open dialogue with managers. And our managers that we hire to invest your funds in, international stocks, they can have those dialogues with us. That's one of the things when we're looking for managers is how are they engaged. Proxy voting, it seems pretty simple and pretty straightforward, but if you just go out and blanketly either don't vote your proxy or just automatically go along with manager, you're not being engaged. So we were actively voting on proxies toward issues we think are important. And then filing resolutions to boards as well so they can be on the proxy. Now, often these times we don't win these files, we don't win these proxies, but by bringing them up and you're shifting the vote, if all of a sudden these votes are getting 20% of the votes or 30% versus 4 or 5%, that starts to get management's attention and they start moving. So there's a step of process. And then if we're not getting the progress we want or see or expect, we divest. Particularly if we can find somebody else in the same space or that we like and same return expectations, we'll shift into there. So it's not a blanket yes or no, but to the quick question, now don't ask me on a whole lot of stocks, but I do know we don't own ExxonMobil in the endowment. So just to that question, Jeff, I know we don't own ExxonMobil, but if you ask me 5 others, I might be able to say, not sure. I'd have to go check. So. This is a section of the investment policy statement that both Rocky and Jason alluded to, and particularly in this quality and liquidity section is where we've incorporated the subject of the investing. So individual securities purchased by the fund shall be in accordance with a socially responsible investing strategy. The SRI criteria will be used to evaluate proposed investments in those asset classes which are applicable. SRI is a values-based alignment of an investment fund or portfolio. ESG analysis, a key element in guiding whether investment decisions under an SRI strategy. ESG criteria assess the performance of companies based on the following factors: environmental, conservation and protection of the natural environment; social, relationships with employees, suppliers, clients, and communities; and governance, standards for company leadership, risk controls, and shareholder rights. The management agent will seek to align recommended investments with the values of WPC, Westminster, for the overall WPC portfolio through the use of management agent ESG investment vehicles and or third-party ESG evaluation tools and investment vehicles. And then the SRI ratings and issues will be reviewed annually by the managing agent with the WPC Investment Committee. And frankly, we review that every quarter with them. So how do we look at managers or funds that we're going to? We look at all the investment managers, we being Wells Fargo, we look at all the investment vehicles that we're considering for any client's portfolio. We do a review on them based on how much they incorporate ESG factors in their process. We rate them 1 to 5, 1 being immaterial or not applicable. Not applicable could be U.S. Treasury notes. The government doesn't go out and make a decision on any of these things. It's the government, right? So we don't go out and try to rate the U.S. government on these things. But it could also be, it's an index fund. If we were buying the S&P 500 index fund, it's not in their process at all. They're following an index, just to give you a sense there. Aware, they have some consideration of ESG factors. The manager can speak to broad ESG themes and how they relate to the portfolio. So to me, that's kind of just, yep, we're aware of it, but we don't really do anything with it. We really, to a certain extent, this to me is a bit in the greenwashing area. Integrated is a key part of the investment process. The manager can speak at granular themes and focuses on materiality. So they are really starting to use it, but it's not necessarily an overriding concern or factor, but it's important to them. And then the two areas, the key driver, this is almost a be-all, end-all for them. This could also be an index fund if it's an index fund that's tracking an ESG index. So it's a key driver for them. And then an impact leader is somebody that's doing the key driver, all these factors, but they're also really out there trying to push positive change. Not just saying, hey, we're finding the best ESG companies. That would be a key driver. Impact leader is one of those managers out there really trying to drive the change and make improvements. And I wanted to, one of the points when Jason was talking about, the roles of the endowment and the goals of the endowment, which is perpetual investing, perpetual support for the church, I think a lot of the environmental and social and governance really speak to that perpetually, because it's not just the perpetuality of the Westminster, it's the perpetuality of our environment and our processes, and if we're not investing along those lines. So I think it's an important factor as well. It's sometimes not as noticeable in short-term results, but I think it's very important for the longer-term results of the world and the portfolio and the endowment. And then we look at each of the managers we have in the funds. So investment grade bonds is managed by our social impact investing fixed income team. They're a key driver. This is a key process. We're out there pushing and trying to improve companies. High yield bonds, we're using Calvert High Yield Fund. It's an impact leader. Principal high yield, they're aware. We're looking and been shifting more and more money from Principal into Calvert, and we'll probably over the next year be fully out of Principal and be fully into Calvert. Cohen & Steers Principal Securities, right now they're the highest rated on our ESG strategy of preferred stock managers. We're always looking for new ones, so we look for opportunities there to upgrade that. Emerging market fixed income is managed by TCW, and it's an integrated approach. It's been much more difficult in international and emerging, particularly in emerging market, to find good ESG managers and strategies. We're continuing to work on that and push for more. U.S. large cap is managed by our social impact investing team here at Wells Fargo. They've actually been managing the portfolio for a long period of time. Even before this was adopted, we were using their strategy. So, and then small cap manager Kane Anderson has been given tremendous returns over the years. It has actually a very good ESG score, but it doesn't use it in its process. It's a high quality manager, and so far, we've wanted to keep it, and the endowment committee has wanted to keep it because of the outstanding ability they've shown on stock picking. In developed markets, we use Boston Common, once again, another impact leader, as well as pairing that with an index, giving us approach there. Index approach for emerging markets, ESG, the ESG aware. And then in commodities, this one is immaterial as well. It's tracking a benchmark following commodity exposure. We had reached out and recommended commodities a number of years ago to Westminster. It's integrated in part of the investment policy statement as part of the weighting. We think it's important as a hedge against the inflation risk to the fixed income portfolio. And then public REITs, so commercial real estate, we're using a sustainable REIT strategy where we own individual REITs, and they're selected by our social impact investing team. So it's integrated into the process quite fully. That's it. So that's really how we've been trying to integrate it into the portfolio. We continue to think it's important. Any questions for me, or Jason, or Rocky? We got somebody back there, Jason.
Thank you for this. How important are decisions made by the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church and their divestment strategies? How much impact does that have and they follow the kind of process that you outlined, years of conversation with companies around specific issues, trying to get people to change, and only sort of as a last-ditch effort do they recommend divestment, which they recently did around those 3 companies related to Israel. How are those automatically implemented in our strategy, or how are those 2 things related?
So presently, they're not explicitly related to how we're managing it. That would really be more directionality that we would receive from Westminster to integrate that.
Let me direct that to Jason, too. Did we develop our policy on our own, or did we form it around PCUSA's?
So that was the shift that the IPS took, was to move from defining socially responsible investing from the MRTI list to an ESG framework. So the MRTI list probably indirectly shows up in. Yes, it's the list of securities or companies that you know don't invest in these businesses, and the investment policy through the work that a subcommittee did, and the recommendations it made, changed from utilizing MRTI, saying, Wells, here's the list, stay away from these companies, to going to this ESG framework that David just talked about. So it's likely indirectly it's influenced, but it's not a consideration any longer.
Thank you. As probably the only person in the room who's done 2 shows at Theater in the Round, I'll throw a different kind of question at you. And really, this is for all 3. We've been looking at the investment side, and I'm happy to see that we're moving towards a more environmental and social justice investing. But my question is more to the church on the giving side. And the question specifically for Rocky and those who have begun to know me is, as we're giving to environmental and social justice organizations and entities and efforts, are we looking at it through a gender lens? As we know that 2/3 of seniors living below the poverty level are women, 2/3 of tipped workers and minimum wage workers are women, almost 2/3 of homeless people are women and children. I'd like to kind of look at the other side of this, and I don't know if that's a whole other presentation or if we can talk about that portion of the results of these investments.
That is not my bailiwick at all. I don't get to decide anywhere where the money goes. They just say, send money over, and we send it over. So, Jeff?
Well, with the 3 of us here, I think we could touch on that. It's kind of the other side of it. We're working hard to use our endowment properly, and our endowment actually does not go much to giving, I think is appropriate to say. But our Enduring Hope campaign is the other leg, one of the legs of the stool that I talked about. And there's a large pool of money now that we're trying to determine. That's going to be our giving pool there. And of course, the deacons and the social justice aspects of Westminster are doing a lot. Do you have more to add to that?
Well, first of all, I can't speak to how the earnings that flow from mission restricted dollars. I can't speak to that. that money goes, in some cases, it goes to specific things like our international partners. There's been some money given for that. But a bunch of it just goes to the Faith and Action Council, and they put it in their budget as part of how they spend it. So you should ask somebody on the Faith and Action Council how much gender is involved. Gender is a clear consideration in ESG. It falls under the socially responsible. So the investment question, when you're looking at ESG, gender is definitely in there and is a major piece. Let me step back from your question a bit. One of the things that allowed this change is that when we did this work in 1986, and I actually chaired that committee, I don't think ESG existed. There was nobody was rating companies on their environmental, social, and governance. That whole concept of rating companies on their performance in these areas developed in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And so suddenly there was available to us this whole different way of looking at investments and having data we could use to do that. And that was one of the things that drove the committee, in answer to your question, Doug, drove the committee to say, let's stop using this list of just we won't invest here. Let's make the entire portfolio respond to these ESG criteria. And I would guess if we went down the portfolio, you would find a lot of the prohibited companies aren't there, but some of them may be. It turned out, as part of our historical analysis, that there were only 2 entities that followed that list religiously, and one was the Presbyterian Investment. The other was Westminster Presbyterian Church. So we were doing pretty well compared to others, but the gender question, I can't. And I think we're almost out of time, so Jeff, you probably ought to close this.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Rocky, Jason, and David. And I've got to thank the 20 online and the people in the room. It's kind of a tough subject. These guys made it pretty as exciting as they could, I think. I should. But, yes, thank you, guys. But, there's responsibility on all members to be aware, and sometimes people fear that they aren't allowed to know what's going on in the church. You have to do this work to understand what we're doing. Next week, Social Justice Forum will be dealing with the racial issue. Does anyone know what a sundown town is? I'm amazed at how much I have learned about racial justice since George Floyd. And next week, Samuel Myers from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, the University of Minnesota, will be discussing his new book, The Minnesota Paradox, which is about that, sundown towns in Minnesota. So please join us next week. Thank you.